welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is, it's pretty ambitious. We are cutting a path through some source material that connects biblical prophecy, centuries of history, and, well, surprisingly precise astronomical cycles.
We really are. We're examining a very specific, and I have to say, controversial theory today. It's this attempt to try and determine the future timing of prophetic events.
Right. Specifically the rapture and the rebuilding of the Third Temple.
Exactly. And it's all based on analyzing these mathematical and astronomical patterns from the destruction of the first two temples.
Okay, let's unpack this a little bit because this isn't just a theological discussion. The core method here feels very analytical.
It is. The people behind this theory, they claim they've isolated a kind of repeatable prophetic blueprint.
A blueprint.
Yeah, using historical markers, the Phi Ratio, and some very specific solar and lunar eclipse patterns. So our job is to walk through their claims, how they use the destruction dates of the first and second temples.
Which both fell on the 9th of Av.
Right, how they use that to basically reverse engineer the timeline for the third temple's future desolation.
That's the part that makes this deep dive so unique, that emphasis on math and astronomy. I mean, they aren't just reading prophetic books. They're using constants like the golden ratio to pinpoint historical events and maybe future ones.
If the math proves the past, the theory goes, then the math can predict the future.
So let's start with that historical anchor. For anyone who isn't familiar with the calendar, the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, is a really tragic day in Jewish history. What's the repeating coincidence that makes this day the starting point for their entire calculation?
Well, the sources focus entirely on the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem. You have the first temple, Solomon's temple, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. Then you have the second temple, which was there in the time of Jesus, destroyed by the Romans under Prince Titus.
And both of these massive catastrophes, hundreds of years apart, happened on the 9th of Av.
On the exact same day. When you see something like that, you have to ask,
is it an accident or a pattern? So how do they argue against it just being a coincidence?
The analysis considers it to be intrinsically prophetic. Like, God specifically chose that date to emphasize a recurring theme.
A theme of desolation.
A theme of desolation and divine timing. And this is where they made the crucial leap. They applied this historical pattern, the destruction of the physical temple, to the spiritual temple.
Which the New Testament calls the body of Christ, or the bride of Christ.
Exactly.
So the working theory becomes what? If the two physical temples were destroyed on Av 9, then the removal of the spiritual temple, the rapture, might also align with that timing.
But as an inversion, not coming down, but going up. That's the analogy they use. Two physical temples came down, so the spiritual temple goes up on a 9th of Av.
Okay, so that narrows the window down. And they actually land on a specific date in their proposed timeline.
They do. For the year 2026, the 9th of Av falls on July 23rd. They see this date as a huge possibility for the culmination of the church age.
And that date fits into their larger temple zone timeline, right? The 2026 to 2033 window.
Precisely. It centers the whole thing around that classic 7-year tribulation period model.
Now, this is where it gets really technical. They don't just, pull 2026 out of thin air. They claim they have mathematically proven the timing of the 70 AD destruction using celestial data. How do they even begin to verify that historical date with astronomical markers?
They look for astronomical cycles that perfectly bracket that period. Specifically, the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD is seen as the fulcrum point between two partial solar eclipse tetrads.
Okay, a tetrad, just for our listener, that's 4 consecutive eclipses, right?
4 consecutive total or near total lunar eclipses. And these tetrads happened in 64 AD and 72 AD. It creates a perfect 8-year bookend around the destruction.
And these tetrads are significant because they're rare and often linked to events concerning Israel in these prophetic studies.
Very much so. The source is basically arguing that this 8-year period contains the entire cycle of judgment. And to make it even more precise, a rare hybrid solar eclipse happened exactly 3.5 years before the 70 AD destruction.
Like a countdown clock in the sky.
A literal countdown marker.
Okay, hold on a second. I have to jump in here. The Phi ratio, the golden ratio, isn't applying a cosmological constant to a biblical event. I mean, isn't that just forcing the data to fit?
Yeah.
How do they defend that?
That's the central question, really. Their argument is that the Phi ratio, that 1.618 constant, you see all through nature.
In seashells, galaxies.
Everywhere. They call it the signature of the creator. So if there's a divine blueprint for history, they believe that signature, that number, has to be woven into the chronology. They're treating time itself as a geometric pattern.
So what happens when you overlay that geometry, that Phi Ratio
Yeah.
spiral, onto that 8-year eclipse window from 64 to 72 AD?
Well, according to the source, the results are shockingly precise. The fulcrum point, the exact mathematical dividing point of that spiral, lands precisely on the year and the month of the Second Temple's destruction.
You mean August of 70 AD?
August 70 AD. Coinciding with the 9th of Av, the math, they claim, pinpoints the exact date.
That is a surprising level of detail. So the big idea here is that if this specific Phi ratio and eclipse pattern define the timing for the Second Temple, then a similar pattern must define the timing for the third.
Yes. They feel they've established a successful formula for the end of the second prophetic timeline. So now they use that same structure to predict the geometry of the third.
And to do that, they have to look at these huge historical spans of time.
Right, spans they consider prophetic. We're talking about the Roman diaspora. It lasted 1,878 years, from 70 AD all the way to 1948 when Israel was reestablished.
And there's a mathematical link there too, isn't there?
There is. If you take the date of the destruction, 70 AD, and you add 1,948 years, you land on 2018.
The 70th year of modern Israel.
Exactly. They see these numbers lining up as confirmation that they're on the right track.
It sounds like the whole historical narrative is built on a three-part restoration, mirroring a three-part destruction.
Absolutely. The restoration of Israel is seen as happening in the exact reverse order of the destruction. First, the land in 1948, then the city, Jerusalem, in 1967, and finally the temple, which is still pending.
And crucially, you're saying the sources argue that those first two restoration stages were also bracketed by these tetrads we were talking about.
That's right. The land in 48 was followed by the 4950 tetrad. The city in 67 was linked to the 6768 tetrad. So the expectation was that the third stage, the temple, should have been kicked off by the most recent one, the 2014-15 tetrad.
But it wasn't. The temple work didn't begin.
Right, and so the source proposes a delay factor.
Okay, so where do they get the template for this delay? Why a specific 16-year gap?
They go back to the rebuilding of the Second Temple after the Babylonian exile. The work started, but then it stalled because of opposition. It just stopped.
For how long?
For 16 years. From 537 BC until it finally resumed in 520 BC.
I see. So that 16-year pause caused by opposition is seen as the historical parallel for the modern geopolitical delay in building the Third Temple.
Precisely. They're using that historical delay as the missing factor needed to adjust the prophetic clock that started with the 2014 tetrad.
Okay, let's do the math then. We take the start date of that last blood moon tetrad.
April 14, 2014.
And we add that 16-year delay factor. Where does that land us?
It lands you squarely in the year 2030. And that is their proposed year for the Abomination of Desolation, the midpoint of the tribulation.
So now we can work backwards to find the start date.
Now you reverse engineer it. You subtract the 42 months, the 1,260 days.
3.5 years.
3.5 years, right. And that points directly to the latter half of 2026 as the year the daily sacrifices have to begin in Jerusalem.
And in this model, it's the start of those sacrifices that officially kicks off the 7-year, 2,520-day tribulation period.
That's the trigger. Which means, if the Ab9 theory is right, the rapture has to happen before those sacrifices start in 2026.
This brings us back to those recurring dates. We just mentioned April 14th, 2014. Let's talk more about that date, because the source sees April 14th, Passover, as this critical repeating element. They call it the Passover Code.
Right. They identify 4 huge prophetic events spanning 2 millennia that all seem to correlate to April 14th. It's used to underline the precision of the whole calendar they're tracking.
Okay, what's the first key date?
April 14th, 32 AD. That's the date the source proposes for Christ's crucifixion.
And the next one?
You jump forward 38 years. April 1470 AD. This was the last Passover that national Israel celebrated in the land before the Roman siege started, and it was marked by a penumbral lunar eclipse.
Then we come to the modern dates, April 14th, 2014, the start of that recent tetrad we've been discussing.
Yes. And finally, they project forward to April 14th, 2033. That's the proposed date of the final Passover blood moon just before the projected return of Christ, which would theoretically wrap up the 2,000-year church age.
The precision of those 4 points, they argue, confirms that the whole timeline is tied to this Passover cycle. But let's circle back one last time to that July 23rd Av9 rapture idea that seems to hinge on a a very specific reinterpretation of Pentecost.
It absolutely does. It relies on what they call a new wine interpretation of the Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. See, the traditional Jewish calendar puts Pentecost, or Shavuot, in June.
But this new wine view is different.
Very different. It asserts that the true Pentecost, the one that birthed the church, actually happened on July 23, 32 AD.
So what does shifting that date allow the source to do?
It creates this new spiritual link. If the spiritual temple, the bride, was born on a July date that corresponds to Av9, the question becomes, what if the end of the church age, the Rapture, happens at a Pentecost feast that is also a 9th of Av?
The symmetry is, well, it's fascinating, regardless of what you believe. 2 physical temples destroyed on Av9, the spiritual temple removed on a future Av9.
It completes a pattern of desolation and removal. And the sequencing is critical for them. They look at the stories of Noah and Lot, where the righteous were removed before judgment fell. So, they insist the rapture must happen before the Antichrist is revealed and before those sacrifices begin in 2026. The third temple is built for the tribulation, for Israel.
This has been a true deep dive into pattern recognition. We have the Av9 destiny, the 2030 abomination of desolation from that 16-year delay, and the 2026 start of the tribulation derived from that Phi Ratio geometry.
And if you look at the structure of Daniel's prophecy, the source material argues for this complex, overlapping timeline. They suggest that the Antichrist's 7-year period will essentially pick up where Jesus was cut off in the middle of Daniel's 70th week. It's all very structured.
So I guess this leaves us with a final question for you, the listener, to think about. If this entire period is so meticulously based on a 7-year cycle, rooted in these specific historical and mathematical patterns linked to an astronomical precision that supposedly pinpoints the very day of destruction, does that intense focus on celestial timing maybe overshadow the spiritual pertinence required for the generation that the source claims will witness his entire sequence of events,